The Hells Angels biker found the little girl cornered behind a fuel pump, and his justice roared hotter than the sun. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was the dead of night, the kind of night that chills the bones and leaves the streets deserted. The sky above was a blanket of black, with only the dim glow of streetlights to guide the way. The rhythmic hum of a motorcycle echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker, was cruising down the empty highway, the engine of his Harley-Davidson roaring beneath him. His thoughts were lost in the hum of the bike and the wind hitting his face, when suddenly, a faint cry broke through the silence. It was almost imperceptible at first, a distant whimper carried by the wind. But Jake's instincts kicked in. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the motorcycle to a screeching halt. He scanned the area, his eyes sharp despite the darkness. The sound of a child's voice, barely audible, carried through the air again. "Please, someone help me." Jake's heart raced. He wasn't the type to get involved in anyone else's mess. He was a biker, an enforcer, someone who lived by a strict code. No attachment, no interference. But something about that voice, desperate and full of fear, made him pause. He dismounted the bike and walked toward the source of the sound. As he neared the fuel pump station, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, crouched behind the metal structure. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was trembling, her tiny body hunched in fear. There was a man standing in front of her, a grimace of anger twisted across his face, blocking her escape. The man was shouting, but the little girl only sobbed quietly, too scared to even speak. Jake's eyes narrowed. He had seen enough in his years to recognize trouble when it was staring him in the face. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The man turned, noticing the biker for the first time, but before he could react, Jake's voice boomed. "Back off." The man sneered, his hands curling into fists, but he hesitated. Jake took a step closer, his presence intimidating, a towering figure clad in leather with tattoos covering his arms. "I said back off," Jake repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The man took a step back, his confidence faltering under Jake's cold gaze. But the little girl's sobs continued, tugging at Jake's heart. He approached her slowly, kneeling down to her level. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now," Jake said, his voice softer than anyone who knew him would expect. The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was clearly terrified, her little hands shaking as they clutched the edge of the fuel pump. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, not just from the man who had cornered her, but from something deeper, something she hadn't shared. "You're not going to hurt me," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. Jake's heart clenched. No one should ever have to feel that kind of fear. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going to hurt you," he reassured her, his voice gentle. He reached out a hand to her, but she flinched, pulling back slightly. Jake stopped, realizing how his intimidating appearance might be just as frightening as the man who had been harassing her. He pulled his hand back slowly, giving her the space she needed. "I'm here to help, okay? You're going to be all right." The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes still darting nervously between him and the man. Then, ever so slowly, she reached out, her tiny hand trembling as she took his. Jake gently helped her to her feet, carefully avoiding any sudden moves that might startle her. He looked over at the man, who was now glaring at him, rage simmering in his eyes. "This is your last warning," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay away from her." The man's anger boiled over, but before he could act, the sound of a siren wailed in the distance. Jake's eyes flicked toward the noise, then back to the girl. He knew he couldn't wait for the police to get here. "We need to get you out of here," he said, looking down at the girl. She nodded, still trembling, but now feeling a bit safer in his presence. He led her toward his bike, keeping his eyes on the man in case he decided to cause more trouble. As they reached the motorcycle, Jake helped the girl climb on behind him, her small hands gripping him tightly. "Hold on," he instructed, his voice firm. With one last look at the man, Jake revved the engine and sped off, the night air rushing past them as they left the fuel station behind. The girl clung to him, her head resting against his back, and for the first time that night, Jake allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Something told him that this encounter was going to lead to something much bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. Jake's Harley roared through the night, the hum of the engine cutting through the crisp air like a blade. He had the girl clinging tightly to his back, her small arms wrapped around his waist. Her breathing, shallow but steady, was the only sound apart from the bike's engine as they sped down the dark, winding road. Despite the adrenaline pumping through him, Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. This wasn't just a simple rescue. Something about this situation felt much bigger than he had anticipated. He stole a glance over his shoulder, making sure the man hadn't followed. The road behind them was empty, but the unease lingered. It was one thing to help a child, but Jake knew better than anyone that getting involved in other people's problems could quickly spiral into something dangerous. The girl had barely spoken since they had left the fuel station, her small form trembling against him. He wasn't sure if it was the cold, the fear, or something else, but he could feel her unease. Jake had been through countless fights, lived through wars, and survived situations that would have broken most men. But the idea of someone hurting a child, it hit him differently. His grip on the handlebars tightened as he focused on the road ahead. He couldn't afford to get distracted. It was then that the sound of the girl's soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice small but filled with a raw, vulnerable need. Jake's heart clenched. He wasn't used to this. In the Hells Angels, emotions were considered weakness. And yet, here he was, caring about a child he had just met, a child who had been terrified moments ago, looking to him for safety. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough but reassuring. "You're safe now." The words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He didn't know for sure if they were safe. Not yet. Not until they got as far from the fuel station as possible. His mind raced, thinking about the man who had been after the girl. The way he had glared at Jake, the hatred in his eyes. It was clear that the girl was only a small part of a bigger story. Jake's gut told him that this wasn't just a random attack. He had seen enough in his years to recognize the signs of something more sinister. But what? The girl's soft gasp broke his thoughts, and Jake turned his attention back to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For helping me." Jake glanced down at her small hands clutching his jacket tightly. She was a stranger to him, and yet, the gratitude in her voice made something inside him stir. "Don't mention it," he muttered, trying to push aside the emotions that were threatening to surface. "I don't do this for thanks." The words didn't sit right with him. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like a lie. As they rode through the night, the distant glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car were the only signs of civilization. The road stretched out ahead, winding through the quiet countryside, but Jake wasn't sure where to go. He needed answers. He needed to know why that man had been after the girl, and what kind of trouble he had dragged her into. His eyes flicked to the girl once more. She was staring out into the dark, lost in her own thoughts. Her silence spoke volumes, and Jake knew there was something more to her story than she was letting on. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small town. It wasn't much, just a couple of houses, a convenience store, and a small diner that looked closed for the night. Jake pulled the bike to a stop in front of a rundown motel. He wasn't sure if it was the safest place, but it was the only option he had at the moment. The girl slid off the bike slowly, still holding on to his jacket like it was her lifeline. She looked around, taking in the small, quiet town with wide eyes. "Is this where we're going to stay?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Jake nodded. "For tonight," he said, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but right now, this was the safest option. As he turned to the motel door, he caught the girl's gaze. Her eyes were filled with questions, the kind that no child should have to ask. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake sighed, his mind still racing. "I don't know yet," he muttered, "but we're going to figure it out." He pushed open the door to the room and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated for a moment before walking inside. Jake closed the door behind her and locked it. The quiet of the room felt like a strange relief after the tension of the night. But deep down, Jake knew that the real battle was just beginning. The girl was safe, for now. But the man who had been after her wouldn't stop until he had answers, and Jake would have to be ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the soft hum of the motel's air conditioning the only sound filling the room. The girl was still asleep, curled up on the bed, her small frame wrapped in the blanket. Jake sat at the small table by the window, his eyes focused on the empty highway outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were only the beginning. He had to find out why that man had been after her, and why he had been so determined to stop Jake from helping. There were too many questions, too many gaps in the story that needed answers. Jake's hand tightened around the coffee cup in front of him. His mind flashed back to the way the man had looked at him, the same look of a predator sizing up its prey. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Jake knew that much. As he stood up, the girl stirred. She blinked her eyes open, and for a moment, Jake saw the fear still lingering in them. She hadn't said much since they arrived, only a few soft words here and there. She was still in shock, but Jake could tell she was starting to warm up to him. She looked up at him, her small voice breaking the silence. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. Her words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. He wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave her alone. "We're going to figure it out," Jake replied, his voice steady. "We're not running anymore." The girl nodded slowly, as if she was beginning to trust him. Jake grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and slipped it on, the leather familiar against his skin. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to get some answers." Jake stepped out of the room and into the crisp morning air. The motel was situated just outside of a small town, surrounded by fields and empty roads. He didn't expect anyone to be around, but the quiet of the place made him uneasy. He needed to find out more about the man who had been chasing the girl. There had to be something in the area, some clue that would lead him to the next step. As Jake walked towards the small gas station next door, he noticed a car parked at the far end of the lot. It was an old sedan, its engine hood open. The man who had been chasing the girl must have been here recently. The thought made Jake's skin crawl. He approached the car cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. As he got closer, he could see that the car's engine was covered in grease and dirt, as if it had been tampered with recently. But there was something more, something strange about the car that made Jake stop in his tracks. A small note was tucked under the windshield wiper. Jake hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, pulling it out and unfolding it. The note was simple, written in a shaky hand. "She's not safe. Don't trust anyone." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Whoever had written this knew exactly who he was. And more importantly, they knew who the girl was. Jake's heart raced as he looked around the parking lot. He was being watched. The note wasn't a warning, it was a message. Someone was tracking him, and they were close. He slipped the note into his pocket and headed back to the motel. His mind was spinning. He had to get the girl out of here, but he couldn't do it alone. There was no telling who was after her or how far they were willing to go. As Jake entered the room, he saw the girl sitting up on the bed, her eyes wide and alert. She knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jake saw the fear in her again. But there was something else, too. A glimmer of understanding. She nodded slowly, standing up and grabbing her small bag. Jake motioned for her to follow him, and together they left the room, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. Jake's motorcycle was parked just outside, the engine still running. They had to move fast. As Jake helped the girl onto the bike, he glanced around the empty lot once more. There was no sign of anyone, but Jake didn't trust that feeling. He knew the calm before the storm all too well. He revved the engine and pulled out onto the road, the girl clutching him tightly as they sped away. But deep down, Jake knew this wasn't over. They weren't just running from one person anymore. They were running from something bigger. And Jake had a feeling that no matter how far they went, it wouldn't be enough to escape what was coming for them. Jake and the girl rode through the night, the wind howling as the Harley sped down the empty highway. His mind was racing. The note, the warning, the strange feeling in his gut. Everything was pointing to something much bigger than a simple act of kindness. The girl, now more composed, clung to him tightly, her small hands gripping his leather jacket as the bike roared down the road. Jake could feel her fear, but it was mixed with a sense of relief, like she was finally starting to believe that she might be safe. But Jake knew better. Safety was a fragile thing in a world where every move could be tracked and every person could be a threat. As they reached a small, rundown diner on the outskirts of a town, Jake pulled over. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot. Jake looked around, scanning the empty lot and the dimly lit street. He had a bad feeling about this. "Stay close," he said to the girl as he dismounted the bike. She nodded, still clutching her bag tightly. Jake led her toward the diner, his senses on high alert. The door creaked as they entered, the warmth inside a welcome change from the cold night air. The diner was empty except for a lone waitress behind the counter. She looked up as they walked in, her eyes briefly flicking to the girl before focusing on Jake. He wasn't sure if she recognized him or if it was just the usual suspicion people felt when they saw a biker like him walk into a small-town diner. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, her voice monotone. Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving the door. "2 coffees," he said, his voice low. He turned to the girl. "Sit down. I'll be right back." The girl, now more relaxed, took a seat at one of the booths while Jake made his way to the bathroom. As he passed the counter, he noticed the waitress watching him, her gaze intense. He didn't trust it. He stepped into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He needed a moment to think, to clear his head. What was going on? Who was after the girl? The warning on the note had been clear: don't trust anyone. That included the people in this diner. Jake's hand clenched into a fist as he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He had made a promise to the girl. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. As he turned to leave, he heard a muffled voice coming from the kitchen. It was low, but Jake's trained ears picked up the word biker. He froze, his heart pounding. Someone was talking about him. He stepped toward the door, his mind racing. He knew he had to act fast. He pushed the door open and walked back to the booth where the girl was sitting. She was still looking out the window, her eyes lost in thought. "We need to go," Jake said urgently, his voice low but firm. The girl looked up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake motioned for her to get up. "We can't stay here. I don't trust anyone in this place." As he turned to leave, the waitress appeared in the doorway. She had a hand on her hip, her expression guarded. "You sure you want to leave?" she asked, her tone sharp. Jake didn't answer. He just reached for the door. But as he stepped outside, he heard the sound of motorcycles revving in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Jake looked around, his instincts kicking in. The girl was already halfway to the bike, but Jake was frozen for a moment, his mind piecing everything together. The girl was in danger, and the people chasing her were getting closer. He had no time to waste. He ran toward the bike, shouting for her to get on. As she climbed onto the back of the Harley, Jake's eyes scanned the parking lot once more. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, the engines rumbling like thunder in the distance. They were almost here. Jake kicked the bike into gear and sped off, the roar of the engine drowning out the world around him. The wind whipped past them, but Jake's focus was laser sharp. He had to lose them. They couldn't let anyone know where they were going next. The girl clung to him tightly as they sped down the highway, the glow of the diner fading behind them. But Jake's heart was heavy. They had barely escaped. He didn't know who was after them, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to stop. Not until they found the girl, and not until Jake was dead. The sun had barely risen when Jake pulled the Harley into an abandoned gas station off the highway. He didn't trust the quiet of the morning. The weight of the situation hung over him like a storm ready to break. The girl had fallen asleep against his back during the ride, her small body exhausted from the night's events. Jake killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his fingers gripping the handlebars, staring out at the empty road ahead. He knew the game had changed. Whoever had been after the girl was not going to stop until they found her. That much was clear. But Jake had a plan. He wasn't going to let them take her, not while he still had breath in his lungs. The girl stirred behind him, her small hand resting on his back. "Where are we?" she asked groggily, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake turned to look at her, his face softening for a moment. He had to admit, it was strange to feel protective of someone. The Hells Angels had never taught him to care for anyone but himself. Yet here he was, risking everything to keep a child safe. "We're safe for now," Jake said, his voice rough but steady. "But we need to keep moving." She nodded, sitting up slowly, her small frame still stiff from the hours on the bike. Jake had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. He climbed off the motorcycle and helped her down, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. It was deserted here, but Jake knew better than to trust the quiet. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low and firm. He could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to happen. The girl clutched her bag tightly as they moved toward the old gas station. There were signs of decay everywhere: peeling paint, broken windows, and rusted pumps that hadn't worked in years. It looked like no one had been here in ages. Perfect for hiding, Jake thought. They needed to get supplies, maybe figure out their next move. As they reached the small store inside the station, Jake's eyes narrowed. He could feel someone watching them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his instincts screaming at him to get ready for trouble. He motioned for the girl to stay low and stay behind him. "Stay here," he whispered. Jake stepped inside the store, his boots echoing on the cracked tile floor. He didn't trust anyone, but he needed information. He needed to know who was chasing them. As he walked past the shelves, he caught sight of an old man behind the counter. The man didn't look up at first, but Jake knew he was being watched. Jake approached the counter slowly, keeping his distance. "You know anything about a man looking for a little girl?" Jake asked, his voice cold. The man's eyes flickered briefly to Jake, then away. He didn't say a word. Jake's patience wore thin. He leaned over the counter, his massive frame intimidating as he looked the man dead in the eye. "I don't have time for games." "Who's after her?" The man finally looked up, his face tense, his lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the door to the store swung open. Jake's hand immediately went to the knife at his side, but he froze when he saw who it was. A tall figure stepped inside, dressed in dark clothing and a long coat. The man's eyes locked onto Jake's, a glint of recognition in them. "You didn't think you could hide from us, did you?" the man said, his voice low and menacing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This was the guy? The one who had been following them. Jake took a step forward, blocking the door. "If you're looking for her, you're going to have to go through me." The man smirked, clearly not intimidated. "We both know you don't have what it takes to stop me," the man said, stepping closer. Jake could feel the tension building, the space between them crackling with danger. The girl's soft voice broke the silence. "Please, don't hurt him." Both men turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart clenched. "Get inside," he said urgently, pushing her back into the safety of the shadows. The man didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on Jake. "This doesn't have to get ugly," Jake warned. "You can walk away now." But the man only chuckled. "You think I'm walking away? I'm just getting started." Before Jake could react, the man lunged at him, his hands grabbing for the knife at Jake's belt. But Jake was faster. He swung his elbow back, connecting with the man's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The man recovered quickly, his eyes filled with rage. "You're going to regret that." Jake didn't wait for him to make the next move. He stepped forward, his fist connecting with the man's face with a sickening thud. The man stumbled, blood dripping from his nose, but he didn't fall. Instead, he grinned. "This is just the beginning," he growled, wiping blood from his lip. Jake's mind raced. He knew he couldn't take this man on alone, not here, not now. He needed backup. He needed to get the girl to safety, and fast. He turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the girl. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice full of urgency. But before she could react, the man lunged again, this time aiming for Jake's side. The knife caught Jake off guard, slashing across his ribs, but Jake didn't let out a sound. He just grabbed the man's arm and twisted, forcing him to drop the knife. In the same motion, Jake shoved him backward into the counter, knocking the man out cold. "We need to go now," Jake said, his voice harsh as he grabbed the girl's hand and ran out the door, heading for the motorcycle. As they sped off into the morning light, Jake's heart still raced. This was far from over, and he had a feeling the worst was yet to come. Jake and the girl sped through the winding roads, the roar of the Harley echoing in the still morning air. His mind was racing faster than the bike. The fight at the diner had made it clear. They weren't just running from one man. They were running from something bigger, something far more dangerous. His body was still aching from the blow the man had landed on him, but Jake didn't have time to stop. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl, her face pale, but her eyes full of resolve. She had become more than just a frightened child. She had become a symbol of the reason Jake was still fighting. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The road ahead was deserted, nothing but empty fields on either side. Jake's instincts told him to keep going, to get as far from that diner as possible, but the thought of what lay ahead weighed heavily on his chest. The girl's soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked, her words cautious. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening on the handlebars. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out." The girl nodded, though Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She was strong, but even she couldn't hide the fear that lingered beneath her calm exterior. Jake knew she was just as scared as he was. They had no plan, no destination. They were just running, trying to stay one step ahead of whoever was chasing them. Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty road behind them. No sign of anyone. Yet, he pushed the bike harder, the wind whipping past them. They needed a place to regroup, to come up with a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. "We need to find some shelter," Jake muttered under his breath. He spotted a small town in the distance. It looked like the perfect place to lay low for a while. "We'll stop there," he said, his voice steady. The girl didn't question him. She trusted him, despite everything. That trust was something Jake hadn't earned, not yet. But he'd do whatever it took to keep her safe. As they entered the town, Jake slowed the bike, scanning the area. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets were empty, save for a few parked cars. He pulled into a small gas station, parking the bike next to the pumps. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low. The girl didn't respond, but she stayed close behind him as they approached the small convenience store. Jake's instincts told him something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it, but something about this place felt off. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside. The store was dimly lit, shelves filled with snacks, bottled drinks, and cigarettes. The man behind the counter looked up at them, his eyes narrowing for a moment before he returned to reading his newspaper. Jake didn't trust him, but there was no way around it. They needed supplies, and this was the only place in town. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice flat. Jake nodded, keeping his distance. "Just some water and snacks," he said, his tone casual. The man grunted and turned to grab a bottle of water. Jake kept an eye on the door, scanning the street outside. His gut told him they weren't alone. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling they were being watched. The girl was looking around, her gaze flicking nervously from shelf to shelf. She was picking up the unease Jake was feeling, and he could see her shoulders tense. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice sharp. He grabbed the water and some chips from the counter, paying quickly before turning to leave. As they stepped back outside, Jake's instincts flared again. He heard the sound of footsteps behind them. Without turning around, Jake reached for the gun hidden under his jacket. He didn't want to use it, but he was ready. He turned to the girl. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice low but firm. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw the figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking towards them with purpose. The man didn't look like he was in a hurry, but Jake could feel the tension in the air. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting between Jake and the girl. "You're the one," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jake's hand tightened on the gun. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with warning. The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "I'm here for the girl," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have to make this difficult." Jake didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, positioning himself between the man and the girl. "You're not taking her," Jake said firmly. The man's smile faded. "You don't have a choice." Jake's hand hovered near the gun, ready to draw. "Then you'll have to go through me." The man took a step back, assessing Jake with cold eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel the girl's presence behind him, her small figure pressing against his back. She was scared, but she was also trusting him to protect her. And he wasn't going to fail her. Not this time. The man finally sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning to walk away. Jake didn't move until the man was out of sight, his footsteps fading into the distance. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You okay?" he asked the girl, turning around. She nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear. "What now?" she asked softly. Jake paused for a moment, considering their next move. "We keep moving," he said. "We're not safe yet." And as they climbed back onto the Harley, Jake's mind was already racing. He didn't know who was after them, but he knew one thing. The fight was far from over. Jake's hands gripped the handlebars tightly as he sped down the narrow, desolate road, the girl still clinging to him, her small body pressed against his back. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, but his focus was razor-sharp. The threat from the man at the gas station wasn't the end of it. Jake knew that much. They weren't just running from one person, they were being hunted. He had made a promise to the girl, and no matter what, he wasn't going to break it. But Jake wasn't foolish. He knew that promises had a price, and the price for keeping her safe was going to be higher than anything he had ever paid before. He glanced over his shoulder, looking down the empty stretch of highway, but the road was clear. No sign of anyone following. Not yet. But the unease in his gut told him that peace wasn't going to last long. "Are we almost there?" the girl asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Her hands were still tightly gripping his jacket, her knuckles white. Jake's heart clenched. He could feel the fear radiating from her, even though she was trying to be brave. "Almost," Jake replied, his voice low but steady. He knew she was scared. Hell, he was scared too. They both were. But there was no time to stop now. There was no time for anything except to keep moving. As they passed through a small, sleepy town, Jake's eyes kept darting to every shadow, every corner. Something didn't feel right. "Pull over," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't want to stop. The last thing he needed was to be cornered in some dead-end street in a town that looked like it hadn't seen a cop in years. But his gut told him that he needed to, that they needed to take a breath before they were caught. He pulled into a rundown motel on the edge of town, parking the bike under a flickering street lamp. The girl slid off the bike and followed Jake inside, her steps hesitant. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. The manager behind the counter barely looked up as they walked in. "Room for two?" Jake asked, his voice still low, keeping his tone casual. Yeah, $50 a night." The manager didn't seem bothered by the presence of two strangers. Jake paid in cash, not giving the guy a chance to ask questions. "Stay close," Jake said to the girl as they made their way to the room. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet worn and frayed. The door to their room creaked as Jake pushed it open. It smelled of stale air and dust. He wasn't concerned with the room itself. What mattered was that they were inside, for now, safe. Jake locked the door behind them and pushed the dresser in front of it. It wasn't much, but it would slow anyone down who came looking. He walked over to the small window, peering out into the empty parking lot. His instincts were on edge, but he didn't see anything unusual. The world felt still, but it was the kind of stillness that made him uneasy. The girl sat down on the bed, her legs dangling over the edge, her hands wringing the hem of her shirt. She was trying to stay calm, trying to be brave, but Jake could see it in her eyes. She was terrified. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, turning to face her. She nodded, but Jake could see the tears starting to form in her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, trying not to let him see. "I'm scared," she said, her voice small. Jake's chest tightened. He didn't know how to comfort her. He wasn't good at that sort of thing. But he couldn't let her see how scared he was too. "I know," Jake said softly. "But we're safe for now. We're not going anywhere until we figure out what to do next." She nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't believe him, not really. And Jake didn't blame her. He didn't believe it himself. There was no way they were safe. Not when they were being hunted by whoever was after the girl. The silence between them stretched on, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Jake rubbed his face with his hands, trying to think. He needed to come up with a plan, but the options were few. The girl was the key, and he didn't have all the answers. He had a feeling that finding out who was after her would be the only way to keep them both alive. But that meant digging into something far darker than either of them had bargained for. "I'll be right back," Jake said finally, breaking the silence. He stepped out of the room, keeping his eyes on the parking lot as he walked toward the payphone on the corner of the motel. He needed to make a call. He needed to talk to someone who might have answers. His hand hesitated over the receiver for a moment, but then he dialed the number he knew all too well. The phone rang once, twice, before the gruff voice on the other end answered. "Jake, you shouldn't be calling me. I need help," Jake said, his voice low. "There's a kid. They're after her." There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke again. "You're in deeper than you think. I'll help, but you need to get out of there. They're watching." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Who? Who's after her?" "That's something you're going to have to figure out yourself. But trust me, Jake, You don't want to be caught in the middle of this." The line went dead before Jake could say anything more. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had just stepped into something much bigger than he ever expected. And now, there was no turning back. Jake walked back into the motel room, the faint sound of the payphone still echoing in his mind. The conversation had been short, but it had left him with more questions than answers. Who was after the girl? Why was this so much bigger than he had first thought? He rubbed his eyes, trying to process everything. The girl was sitting on the bed, her hands still clutching her bag, but now she was staring at the door. She could sense something had changed in the air. "Jake?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked at her, trying to mask the tension in his features. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm, but he could hear the edge of uncertainty in it. "What's happening? Why are they after me?" Jake let out a deep breath. He couldn't sugarcoat this. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out." He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. The girl's eyes were filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She had been through so much already, and now she was in the middle of something much darker than she could comprehend. "Are you going to leave me?" she asked, her voice small, vulnerable. The question hit Jake harder than he expected. He had been trying to keep her safe, to shield her from the truth, but the reality was sinking in. He couldn't protect her forever. "No," he said firmly, his voice softer than usual. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." The girl nodded slowly, but Jake could tell she wasn't convinced. She had to feel it too, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Jake turned and walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. The night had fallen completely, the darkness settling over the town like a blanket. There was no sign of anyone watching, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. Jake's thoughts raced. He had to make a plan. He couldn't keep running. He needed answers. And the only way to get them was to confront whoever was pulling the strings. But first, he needed to get the girl out of the motel. He couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. The longer they stayed, the more chance there was that whoever was after them would find them. "We need to move," Jake said abruptly, turning back toward the girl. She didn't hesitate. She stood up immediately, her small figure moving toward him without a word. They didn't have time for explanations. The weight of the situation was too heavy for either of them to ignore. As they walked toward the door, Jake took one last look around the room, making sure everything was in place. He opened the door cautiously, checking the hallway for any signs of trouble. It was empty. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting him in the face. The night felt even darker now, like the world was holding its breath. He could hear the sound of his boots against the gravel as they moved toward the motorcycle. Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and then to the road behind them. No sign of anyone. He quickly helped the girl onto the bike, securing her in place behind him. As he revved the engine, the sound felt almost too loud in the quiet night. He glanced at the girl one last time before they took off. She was gripping him tightly, her small hands wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. Jake knew she was scared, and as much as he wanted to tell her everything would be okay, he couldn't make that promise. The road stretched out before them, a long, dark path with no clear end. Jake's mind raced as they sped down the highway, the wind rushing past them. Every minute that passed brought them closer to whatever danger was waiting. Jake didn't know who was after them, but the message was clear. They weren't going to stop until they had the girl. And that meant Jake had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to slow down, not now. He had to stay ahead. The girl had already lost so much. The last thing he wanted was for her to lose him too. He took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, the headlights of the bike cutting through the darkness. The girl's grip tightened as they swerved around the corner, but Jake didn't slow down. He needed to get to a safe place, somewhere they could think, plan. He couldn't keep running in circles forever. After a few miles, he pulled into an old cabin tucked away in the woods. The place looked abandoned, but that's exactly what Jake needed. Somewhere isolated, somewhere hidden. He cut the engine and turned to the girl. "We'll stay here for now," he said, his voice steady but low. The girl didn't say anything, but Jake could see the relief in her eyes. They were safe, for now. But Jake knew this was only temporary. The real fight was still coming. And this time, it wasn't just about keeping the girl safe. It was about finding out the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. He wouldn't stop until he had all the answers. The cabin was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside, carried by the wind. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkened woods around them. It had been hours since they'd arrived, and still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. His mind kept circling back to the conversation on the phone earlier that day, the cryptic warning that something much bigger was at play. The girl was in danger, and Jake knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. He'd put them in a safe spot for now, but every instinct in his body told him they needed to move soon. He turned away from the window and looked at the girl. She was sitting on the old couch in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the floor. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, the weight of the night pressing down on them both. She hadn't said much since they arrived, her small frame stiff with fear. Jake walked over to her slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. He didn't know what to say. Words felt useless at a time like this. He'd promised to keep her safe, but the road ahead was only getting darker. "How are you holding up?" Jake finally asked, his voice softer than usual. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she hugged her knees tighter. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "What are we going to do?" Jake's heart tightened. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to caring this much. He had always been the guy who kept his distance, the loner who didn't let anyone get too close. But here he was, with this girl who was depending on him, and he couldn't let her down. "We're going to find out what's going on," Jake said, his voice firm. "We're not just running anymore. We're going to fight back." The girl's eyes searched his face, looking for something: comfort, reassurance, maybe even hope. But Jake wasn't sure he could offer her any of those things right now. The truth was, he didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't have all the answers. But what he did know was that he wasn't going to let her get caught in whatever storm was coming. He walked over to the small table in the corner of the room and pulled out the phone he had used to make that call earlier. The line had gone dead before he could get any useful information, but he had a feeling the answers he needed were out. There. He dialed again, waiting as the phone rang. This time, the line clicked, and a voice came through, rough and hurried. "Jake," the voice growled. "You shouldn't be calling me. I need to know what's going on," Jake said, his voice steady. "Who's after her?" The voice on the other end paused for a moment before responding. "You're in way deeper than you realize. You've already put a target on your back." Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't have time for cryptic warnings. "Just tell me who's behind this," he demanded. "I need answers." The voice sighed. "It's bigger than you think, Jake. You're messing with the wrong people." Jake gripped the phone tighter, the words cutting through him like a knife. "Who? Who is it?" The voice hesitated again, and when it spoke, there was a hint of fear in its tone. "They're not just after her. They're after you too. And trust me, Jake, they won't stop until they get what they want." The line went dead again, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. He threw the phone down on the table, his mind racing. The girl was right. This wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. Whoever was after them was much more dangerous than Jake had ever imagined. He walked over to the girl, who was now standing by the door, her eyes filled with worry. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. The girl nodded, fear flickering across her face. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't want to lie to her, but he couldn't tell her everything. He couldn't let her see how much danger they were really in. "Yes," he said quietly. "But we'll be okay. We're going to keep moving." He grabbed her hand and led her out of the cabin, the night air cold against their skin. Jake didn't know what was waiting for them, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. And he wasn't going to stop until he had answers, no matter what the cost. They had no choice now. They were in this together, and the road ahead was dark, but Jake was ready to face whatever came next. Jake rode through the darkened roads, the growl of his Harley cutting through the silence. The girl clung to him tighter than before, her small hands gripping his jacket with a mixture of fear and desperation. The weight of the situation pressed on him. He could feel her trembling against his back. He had promised to protect her, but as the night stretched on, it felt like the storm they were running from was only getting closer. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once again. No sign of pursuit. Yet, Jake didn't believe in coincidences. He had learned the hard way that in this world, if someone wanted something badly enough, they would come for it, no matter the cost. And whoever was after the girl had no intention of stopping. As they crossed into another town, Jake slowed the bike. The town was small, almost forgotten, with only a few scattered lights glowing in the distance. He needed to get supplies, maybe find a way to throw off their pursuers, but more than that, he needed information. Whoever was chasing them was well organized. It wasn't just some random stalker. It was someone with resources, with a plan. And that scared Jake more than anything else. He pulled the bike into a small gas station, the neon sign flickering in the dim night. The girl hopped off the bike quickly, her feet hitting the ground softly. She looked around, her eyes darting between the shadows. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, following him toward the station's entrance. The door jingled as they walked in. The inside of the gas station was small and run down, the fluorescent lights flickering above. There was a man behind the counter, middle-aged with a weary look on his face. He didn't seem surprised to see Jake and the girl walk in, but he gave them both a long look before returning to his magazine. Jake approached the counter and grabbed a few snacks, his eyes scanning the store quickly. "How's business?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. The man didn't respond right away, but after a moment, he looked up, his eyes sharp. "Not much to report around here. Quiet town." Jake nodded, his instincts telling him that something was off. The man's response was too rehearsed, too careful. It was like he was waiting for something. Or someone. "Just passing through," Jake said, his tone neutral. "Keep the change." He handed the man a few bills and turned, walking back toward the girl. He could feel the tension in the air. As they headed out the door, Jake caught a glimpse of a figure leaning against a car in the parking lot. The man's posture was relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that made Jake pause. His gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. The man didn't move as Jake and the girl approached the bike. Instead, he watched them with an intensity that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. The figure pushed himself off the car slowly and started walking toward them. Jake's hand went instinctively to his jacket, his fingers brushing the handle of his knife. He wasn't sure who this guy was, but he wasn't about to let anyone get too close to the girl. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but cold. The man didn't respond right away. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning Jake before landing on the girl. "You're the one they're looking for, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and ominous. Jake's heart rate quickened. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't just some random stranger. This man knew exactly who they were, and that meant trouble. "Who are you?" Jake asked, stepping forward, positioning himself between the man and the girl. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they have the upper hand. "Doesn't matter," the man replied, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I'm just here to deliver a message." Jake's grip tightened around the knife handle, but he didn't draw it. He was trying to keep the situation from escalating, but the man wasn't backing down. "What kind of message?" Jake asked, his voice low. The man chuckled darkly. "It's simple. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. The girl is ours, and if you don't hand her over, you're going to regret it." Jake's eyes narrowed. The girl was standing just behind him, her small figure almost invisible next to his. He could feel her fear, but she trusted him, and that was something he couldn't lose. He turned slightly, glancing at her. "Stay behind me," he said softly, but the girl shook her head. She wasn't going to be hidden away while this was happening. "No," she said quietly. "I can't hide anymore." The man's eyes shifted back to the girl, and for a moment, Jake saw something flicker in the man's gaze, recognition, maybe even surprise. Then it was gone. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man warned, taking a step forward. "Give her to me, and we'll let you go." Jake stood his ground. He wasn't giving up the girl, not without a fight. "I'm not handing her over to anyone," Jake said firmly, his eyes locked on the man. "Not to you, not to anyone." The man sighed, the smile fading from his face. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable." Then, without warning, the man lunged at Jake, his fist aiming for his chest. Jake sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The man grunted in pain but quickly regained his footing, spinning around to face Jake. "You really want to make this harder on yourself?" the man sneered. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection and sending him crashing to the ground. The man struggled beneath him, but Jake's weight kept him pinned. "Stay down," Jake growled. But just as Jake thought he had the upper hand, the sound of approaching engines broke through the tension. More motorcycles, and they were coming fast. Jake's heart sank. This was just the beginning, and he had no idea what kind of storm they were about to ride into. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, echoing through the quiet gas station lot. Jake's heart raced as he pushed the man beneath him harder into the gravel, his eyes darting toward the incoming threat. The roar of engines sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. More bikers. They were closing in fast. You should have listened, the man grunted beneath Jake, still trying to free himself, but Jake kept him pinned down. Shut up, Jake growled, barely paying attention to the man beneath him. His mind was focused on the approaching bikes. He could feel the vibrations in the ground from their engines, and his gut told him these weren't just random riders. These were the people who had been after the girl, the ones who wouldn't stop until they had her. Get off me, the man hissed, but Jake wasn't budging. You want her that badly? Jake snapped, his eyes locking onto the approaching riders. You'll have to go through me. The man, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, stopped resisting, his body going limp beneath Jake. Jake stayed on top of him for a moment longer, watching as the first bike came into view, its headlights cutting through the night. They were here. The girl was still standing by the bike, frozen, her wide eyes staring at the group of approaching bikers. Jake stood up slowly, his hand still on the man's chest to keep him down. Stay close to me, he said, his voice firm, but the girl didn't move. Please, she whispered. Are they going to hurt us? Jake looked at her, his heart heavy. He didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know what these men were capable of, but he knew one thing. They weren't going to let the girl go without a fight. As the bikers stopped just a few feet away, Jake's mind was racing. There were 5 of them, all wearing the same black leather jackets with patches. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. They were part of the same group, the same people who had been after the girl all along. One of them, a tall man with a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and his cold eyes locked onto Jake's. We've been looking for you, he said, his voice low and menacing. Jake's jaw tightened. I'm not giving her to you, he said, his voice steady. You can try, but you won't get far. The man smiled, a humorless grin that sent a chill down Jake's spine. You don't have a choice. You're outnumbered. Jake glanced around. They were surrounded, and even with the element of surprise, he knew this wouldn't be easy. But he wasn't backing down. I'm not afraid of you, Jake said, his voice louder now. The man's smile faltered for a second, then he nodded toward the others. Take him, he ordered. Without warning, the other bikers dismounted and started walking toward Jake. They were armed, knives and chains hanging from their belts, the clink of metal filling the air. Jake stepped back, positioning himself in front of the girl. She hadn't moved, her eyes locked onto the bikers, fear and uncertainty evident on her face. Get behind me, Jake said to her, his voice sharp. She hesitated, but then slowly obeyed, stepping behind him. Jake could feel the weight of her fear, but he had to focus on the fight ahead. You really think you can stop all of us? The scarred man asked, his voice mocking. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the knife from his belt, the blade catching the faint light from the gas station. His body tensed, ready for whatever was coming. The first biker lunged at him, swinging a chain. Jake dodged, sidestepping quickly and slashing with the knife, catching the man across the arm. The biker let out a roar of pain, stumbling back, but Jake didn't have time to enjoy the victory. Another biker charged, this time with a bat. Jake blocked the swing with his forearm, the impact jarring, but he quickly retaliated with a punch to the man's stomach. The man grunted, stumbling backward, but Jake didn't stop. He knew he had to finish this fast. The scarred man stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. You're not going to win this, he said, raising a gun. The sight of the weapon made Jake freeze for a moment, but only for a moment. His mind raced. He had to make a choice, fight or run. But there was no running now. He couldn't leave the girl behind. He lunged at the man with the gun, knocking it out of his hands in a swift motion. The gun clattered to the ground, but the scarred man was fast. He grabbed Jake by the collar and slammed him into the gas station pump. Jake's breath left him in a rush, but he quickly recovered, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The man hissed in pain, but Jake didn't let up. With a sharp move, Jake drove the man to the ground, pinning him with his knee. The other bikers were starting to close in, but Jake didn't care. He'd come this far. He wasn't backing down. Leave her alone, Jake spat, his voice thick with anger. The scarred man glared up at him, his breathing heavy. You don't know who you're messing with, he growled. Jake's fist collided with the man's face, knocking him unconscious. He didn't have time to watch him fall. The others were still standing, and Jake could hear the girl's faint voice behind him. "Jake, what now?" she asked. Jake turned to face her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We get out of here," he said, pulling her close. "And we keep moving. We can't stop now." He turned toward the remaining bikers, his heart pounding. "I won't let them hurt you." Jake and the girl moved quickly, leaving the chaos of the gas station behind them. The fight had taken more out of him than he'd care to admit, but adrenaline kept his legs moving as he led her toward the bike. His mind was still racing, the sound of the motorcycles echoing in his head, their engines rumbling in the distance. The fight wasn't over. He knew that. There was no escaping the danger that was hunting them down. He could feel the weight of the girl's eyes on his back as she climbed onto the bike behind him. She was silent, her small hands gripping his jacket, but he could tell she was scared. And why wouldn't she be? She'd just seen men willing to do whatever it took to get to her. "Hold on tight," Jake muttered, kicking the bike into gear. They sped away from the gas station, the wind whipping past them, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of anyone following. For now, they were safe. But Jake knew better than to trust that. As they drove through the empty roads, the girl's voice finally broke the silence. "Are we really safe?" she asked, her words soft, almost like a whisper. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars. He didn't know how to answer. How could he tell her that they weren't? How could he explain that they were caught in something much bigger than both of them? "We're safe for now," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "But we need to keep moving." He didn't want to lie to her, but he didn't want to scare her either. The truth was, he didn't have a plan. He didn't know where to go next or how to get away from the people hunting them. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let her down. As the miles ticked by, Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind turning over their next move. He had to find somewhere to lay low, somewhere they could figure out what was going on. But as they approached a small town, something caught his eye. There was a diner ahead, a few cars parked outside, and a couple of people standing near the entrance. It wasn't much, but it looked like a place they could blend in for a while. Jake slowed the bike and pulled off the road, stopping in front of the diner. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. He didn't want to make a scene. They needed to keep a low profile. "Stay close," Jake told the girl, his voice firm. She nodded and followed him as he walked toward the entrance. The diner was small, but it was clean, and the air smelled like fresh coffee and fried food. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in, and the few people inside glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Jake didn't see anyone who looked suspicious, but he still felt the tension in the air. The girl sat down at a booth, her eyes scanning the room, but she didn't say anything. Jake stood by the counter, his mind racing. He needed to get more information. He needed to know who was behind this, who was after them. The waitress behind the counter looked at him, her eyes lingering for a moment before she spoke. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice flat. Jake glanced at the menu on the wall, but didn't really see it. "Just coffee," he said, his voice low. He needed to think. As the waitress poured his drink, Jake's eyes flicked to the girl. She was still watching him, her face filled with uncertainty. He didn't want to burden her with the truth, but he knew she needed to hear it. "We're not safe here," Jake said, keeping his voice low enough so only she could hear. She didn't react at first, but then her eyes widened slightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake leaned closer. "I don't know who's behind this," he said, "but whoever it is, they won't stop until they get what they want." The girl's grip tightened on her cup, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, as if she understood. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was getting out of hand. They were running out of time, and he didn't know where to turn next. As he looked out the window, his heart sank. He saw the unmistakable shape of a black SUV parked across the street, its headlights turned off but still visible in the reflection of the diner's glass door. "We have to go," Jake muttered under his breath. He turned toward the girl, his eyes locked onto hers. "Now." The girl stood up immediately, her eyes wide with fear. She knew. She knew they weren't safe. Jake paid the waitress quickly, leaving a tip on the counter. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her toward the door. As they stepped outside, Jake's mind was already working. The SUV was still parked across the street, and he could see two men sitting inside. They hadn't made any move yet, but Jake could feel the danger closing in. "We need to move fast," Jake said, his voice sharp. He helped the girl onto the bike, then revved the engine, his eyes locked on the SUV. As they pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The SUV didn't follow immediately, but Jake wasn't fooled. He knew they were still being hunted. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: they couldn't stop now. Not until he found out who was behind all of this, and why they wouldn't stop until the girl was theirs. Jake's hands tightened on the handlebars as he raced down the dark highway, the roar of the Harley's engine filling the night air. The girl clung to him tightly, her small hands gripping his jacket with desperate urgency. He had no idea where they were going, but one thing was certain: they couldn't keep running forever. The pursuit was relentless, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to stop until they had the girl. Jake glanced over his shoulder, but the road behind them remained empty. For now, they were safe. He pushed the bike faster, the wind whipping past them. The girl's head rested against his back, her body tense with fear. It had been hours since they'd left the diner, but the weight of the night's events still hung heavy. The question that kept nagging at Jake's mind was why. Why were they after her? What was so important about this girl that they would stop at nothing to get her? The questions had been swirling in his head since he first laid eyes on her, but they were no closer to an answer. All he knew was that he couldn't let them get their hands on her. Not after everything they'd been through. As they approached a small town, Jake slowed the bike, scanning the area. It was quiet, the kind of place where no one asked questions. He needed to make a plan, figure out what to do next, but he couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Every moment they spent here increased the risk of someone finding them. He pulled into a small, run-down gas station, parking the bike near the pump. The girl slid off the bike, her legs shaky as she stood. Jake motioned for her to stay close, and they walked into the small convenience store. The fluorescent lights flickered above them as they entered. It smelled like stale coffee and old newspapers. The store was empty except for a clerk behind the counter, who barely looked up as they entered. Jake kept his distance, scanning the room carefully. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. "You need anything?" the clerk asked, his voice bored. Jake gave a quick shake of his head. "Just a couple of waters," he replied. As the clerk grabbed the bottles, Jake's eyes flicked to the door. He could feel the unease creeping in. He didn't know what it was, but something about this place felt wrong. The clerk handed him the bottles, his eyes lingering on the girl for a moment before returning to his work. Jake paid, his senses on high alert. "Let's go," he said to the girl, turning toward the door. But as they stepped outside, Jake froze. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his side. Across the parking lot, he saw a man leaning against a car, watching them intently. The man didn't move, but Jake could see the way his eyes tracked every step they took. "We're being watched," Jake muttered under his breath. The girl's eyes widened, and she instinctively moved closer to him. Jake kept his eyes on the man, trying to decide their next move. The man didn't approach, but Jake wasn't about to take any chances. "Get on the bike," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. The girl hesitated, but then nodded, climbing onto the bike as Jake started it up. He glanced at the man one last time, his mind racing. They had no time to waste. They needed to leave before things escalated. As Jake revved the engine, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know that the man was coming toward them. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, Jake threw the bike into gear and sped off, the tires squealing against the pavement. The girl held on tight, her arms wrapping around his waist as they tore through the night. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he focused on the road ahead. They couldn't stop now. The man was chasing them, and he wasn't the only one. Jake's mind raced. Whoever had been hunting them before was still out there, and now they had to deal with this new threat as well. It was only a matter of time before the chase caught up with them. As they sped through the winding roads, Jake pushed the bike faster, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. He needed a plan, but for now, all he could do was keep moving. The girl clung to him, her small body pressed against his back. He knew she was scared, but she didn't speak. She trusted him, and that made everything even more complicated. He wasn't used to having someone rely on him. He wasn't used to being the one who had to protect someone else. They had to find shelter, but Jake knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The girl was a target, and as long as she was with him, so was he. They were running out of time. As they approached a small motel on the outskirts of another town, Jake slowed the bike, his eyes scanning the area. The place looked quiet, almost abandoned. He pulled into the parking lot and stopped the bike, glancing around. The girl climbed off, her eyes still scanning the area for threats. Jake didn't want to stop, but he knew they couldn't keep moving forever. They needed to regroup, to come up with a plan. "Stay close," he said again, his voice low and firm. The girl nodded and followed him into the motel, keeping close behind him as they entered the dimly lit lobby. The clerk behind the desk didn't look up as they walked in, but Jake's instincts told him they were still being watched. They couldn't afford to stay here long. Jake paid for a room, and as they made their way to the door, he looked around once more. They weren't safe yet. They wouldn't be until they found out who was after the girl. And Jake wasn't about to stop until he had the answers. In this intense and gripping story, Jake, a seasoned Hells Angels member, finds himself in the midst of a dangerous pursuit after rescuing a young girl from a mysterious group. As they try to escape, they are hunted by unknown enemies with hidden motives. The tale unfolds in a series of high-stakes moments that bring out the raw emotions and survival instincts of both Jake and the girl. The relentless chase forces them to stay one step ahead of their pursuers, all while uncovering the dark secrets that tie them together. As they cross small towns and face life-threatening encounters, Jake's loyalty and determination to protect the girl are tested to their limits. This story is filled with action, suspense, and unexpected twists, making it one of the most compelling Hell Angels stories. The deeper they go into the unknown, the more dangerous their situation becomes. Jake's past as a Hells Angels member comes back to haunt him, but his commitment to keeping the girl safe drives him to push through every challenge. As they finally stop at a quiet diner, their peace is shattered, and they must continue their flight, knowing they're being hunted. The story reaches its peak as Jake fights not only for their survival, but also to unravel the mystery of who's behind the pursuit. With each turn of events, the danger escalates, and Jake finds himself face to face with a shocking revelation. With danger lurking at every corner, this Hell Angel story keeps you on the edge of your seat, wondering what will happen next. Stay tuned for the next part as the stakes get higher in this action-packed adventure.